Hello, friends. Here he is again, Ola Wikander, your friendly neighborhood Ugaritologist, and today the very same is about to talk to you about what really is up with Northwest Semitic. In the episode before, I talked about the big stuff, Afro-Asiatic. What's up with that? It's weird, right? Do listen to that video or watch that video if you haven't done so already. Now we're going to focus down, more of a hyper focus, down on Northwest Semitic, which is kind of my wheelhouse. Northwest Semitic is a sub-branch of Semitic, and as we just discussed in the previous video, Semitic is itself just a sub-branch of Afro-Asiatic. But again, Northwest Semitic is one sub-branch of Semitic, and there's even more than that. It's a sub-branch of West Semitic. First, you divide Semitic into East Semitic, which is basically just Akkadian and Eblite, and West Semitic, which is the rest. Then you divide up West Semitic into various sub-branches, one of which is Central Semitic, and Central Semitic is made up of Arabic and Northwest Semitic and possibly some other stuff, but that's a bit controversial, so I won't go into that. But generally speaking, we have Semitic, West Semitic, Central Semitic, Northwest Semitic, if we want to zoom in onto Northwest Semitic. And which languages do we find in the Northwest sub-branch? Well, we have to think about what part of the world we're talking about. We're talking about the ancient Near East / Southwest Asia, which means that Northwest means what is today Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria. That's Northwest in this area. We have to think about what area we are talking about. So in this area, there were a number of languages from the Semitic family spoken in antiquity, and some of them still are. Only two Northwest Semitic languages are spoken today. One of them is modern Hebrew, and the other one is the many varying forms of Aramaic. Today, Aramaic is not one language. It started becoming several languages already in antiquity, and today it's a whole plethora of different languages that are subsumed into the supercategory Neo-Aramaic. There are so many variants of Neo-Aramaic spoken across the Middle East and in various diaspora communities that you cannot really call it one language anymore, and you haven't been able to do that for a long time. But Northwest Semitic is made up of Aramaic, Ugaritic, my own specialty, and the various languages known as Canaanite, of which Hebrew is one. The others are such languages as Moabite and Phoenician and Ammonite. And all these languages are pretty close to one another, especially the Canaanite ones. Those are as close as the Nordic languages are today, which would mean that in antiquity, people speaking Phoenician and people speaking Hebrew probably would have understood each other. Definitely Hebrew and Moabite, which are extremely close. But so, what's up with Northwest Semitic? It's a subgroup. What's the problem? The problem is that when we do historical linguistics and want to do nice trees, draw nice trees of linguistic relatedness, we want what's referred to as common innovations. That is, linguistic innovations, either phonological or morphological, or in some cases lexical, even though that's more iffy since words can easily be borrowed. Innovations that occur at one point in the cladistic tree, and then when the linguistic tree continues to diverge, you can follow that innovation through all the nodes that are lower down on the tree. That is, if a linguistic change happened in, say, Proto-Canaanite, you want to find that linguistic change being reflected in all the Canaanite languages which descended from Proto-Canaanite. That's actually the most classical way of defining a quote-unquote node in a linguistic tree. That is a latest common ancestor at one stage. You want to see common innovations that happened at that stage and then survived in ideally all the descendants of that stage, that linguistic stage. Sometimes there can, of course, be reverse developments, but those have to be explained as one goes along. The problem with Northwest Semitic as a node in a tree, in the Semitic tree, is the fact that there are quite few such common innovations that actually do seem to unite all the languages normally referred to as Northwest Semitic, which has led some scholars to question whether Northwest Semitic was ever one language, that is, whether there ever was a Proto-Northwest Semitic at all, or whether these are just Central Semitic languages that happen to be spoken in close proximity to one another, leading to some convergence and lots of borrowings and stuff. Given that I work on Proto-Northwest Semitic and specifically Proto-Northwest Semitic poetics, I am a bit hesitant to torpedo the whole idea of Northwest Semitic as a linguistic unity. The common innovations of Northwest Semitic are a bit scant, to be sure, but I do believe that they're enough. For example, one very specific phonological change that happened in all Northwest Semitic languages is the change of initial w to y, except in the word for and, wa. We can see this in the Arabic word walada, gave birth, and Hebrew yalad. And this change goes through the whole of Northwest Semitic. All the languages referred to as Northwest Semitic have switched initial words to yes, except in the word wa, and. And this is weird. This is not something that would easily spread, I'd say. So this is probably an actual sound change that goes back to Proto-Northwest Semitic. And there are a couple of other changes, like a few innovations in how certain verbal stems are formed, and also the proliferation of so-called segulate nouns, that is, nouns that appear in Hebrew as, say, melech or kesef or derech, these nouns, or o-e or e-e, which in earlier stages of the language was nouns of the form, if we use and le as the prototypical radicals. Actually, it's the old verb for kill, but it's often used as a sort of paradigm set of consonants. Then it's qatl, qitl, and qutl nouns. That is, nouns with those patternings, which get a very specific sort of plural with an infixed long R. Relatives of that do appear in other Semitic languages outside of Northwest Semitic, but they have proliferated a lot in Northwest Semitic and become sort of a category unto themselves. And that could also be regarded as sort of a common innovation. So what I think happened was that, yes, there was a Proto-Northwest Semitic language that can be reconstructed and which did have a literary tradition which can partly be reached through the reconstruction of poetic formulae and so on. But that this was a very short period of common development, which quickly diverged into several languages. But those languages, those immediate descendants of Proto-Northwest Semitic, were spoken in such close proximity that they never really stopped talking to each other, at least not until much, much later, which meant that they kept borrowing stuff, they kept influencing each other, which muddies the waters and creates this look of wave interference rather than linguistic descent in a tree fashion, which is, again, what most historical linguists are used to. So I think that's what's up with Northwest Semitic. It actually was a valid node in the tree of Semitic languages, but one which was brief and, as one scholar puts it, amorphous, that is, not very clearly defined in terms of common innovations. There were a few. I still believe, yes, there were a few common innovations that go back to Proto-Northwest Semitic, but there are relatively few of them. And then almost immediately, Proto-Northwest Semitic started diverging into various dialects and then various languages, which were spoken in extreme proximity, which meant that they continued influencing each other as they went. Again, referring to the previous talk, it's the exact opposite of what you find in Indo-European, for example, where the various branches neatly separate from each other and just diverge in all directions and move across huge swaths of territory, whereas the Semitic languages, and most specifically the Northwest Semitic languages, kept in a very, very sort of tight area, the Levant in the case of Northwest Semitic, which meant that they continued influencing each other basically from the day they started diverging. So Proto-Northwest Semitic, yes, but Northwest Semitic also continued a sort of weird intermingling as the centuries wore on. And Northwest Semitic, you can't read Proto-Northwest Semitic texts in their original languages because there are no Proto-Northwest Semitic texts because it's a proto-language. That normally means it's not attested. But texts in early Northwest Semitic, like Ugaritic, for example, those texts read best in those original languages. Thanks and goodbye.